As you probably know, Primary Source is a nonprofit organization, and in order to bring global perspectives to K-12 classrooms across New England and the United States, we provide graduate courses, workshops, and study tours for about 1,800 educators each year. And our programs give teachers background knowledge for teaching ideas on Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and the United States. An increasing number of Primary Sources courses and workshops support globally minded classrooms with an emphasis on themes that encompass multiple world regions as well. Additionally, our 7,000-piece library and growing online curriculum collection provide a wealth of international education resources for schools. You can learn more about us and our programs, both private and public, at our website, which is found at www.primarysource.org. Today's webinar on Afghan politics and political culture is the first in a series of 3 webinars co-sponsored by the Asia Society in their homeland Afghanistan line research. We're really lucky to have Professor Thomas Barfield of Boston University with us today as our speaker. Dr. Barfield is a professor of anthropology and director of the Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilization at Boston University. He also serves as the president of the American Institute for Afghanistan Studies. His research focuses on problems of reconstruction and political development in contemporary Afghanistan, with a particular emphasis on questions of customary law and its role in conflict resolution. Dr. Barfield will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. You can send in your questions using the question box throughout the webinar. You can just send those in, and we'll kind of sort through those and get those ready for the Q&A time. Or you can also explain you can also call in later, and I'll explain how you can do that. So now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Barfield. We'll switch it over so he has audio here. There we go. And can you hear me? Dr. Barfield, are you there? Some technical difficulties. Let's see. I have him as unmuted. Maggie, are you sure?
Hi, Liz. I think he's unmuted, so let's just give it a
okay.
minute. There we
go.
go.
There we go. It took a minute.
I believe.
Right.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you very
I'll
much.
turn it over to you.
I'm going to do a brief. Thank you very much. I'm going to do a brief review of political legitimacy in Afghanistan. While I'll focus to some extent on the present, one really can't understand Afghanistan without looking at the past. I'll say a few words about pre-19th century Afghanistan. And in particular, today, Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires, a land of incessant insurgencies, of people that are unconquerable, ungoverned. 19th century history of Afghanistan. You would discover that Afghanistan was better known as the highway of conquest. That is, that many conquerors who were mostly on their way to India conquered Afghanistan as their base in order to do it. And what we discover is that Afghanistan was ruled by many famous empires. Alexander the Great, who, while he left the Syrian kingdom, ruled for another couple of centuries. Mahmud of Ghazni, a famous Islamic conqueror who used to raid India. And Mongols ruled this territory for a couple of centuries. A collateral descendant of Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, also known as Timur, ruled Afghanistan in the 14th and 15th century, and actually at one time his dynasty had its capital in Herat. And finally Afghanistan, in the colonial period, by Mughal India and Safavid Iran. Afghanistan was ruled by outsiders. Now, to understand how they managed to rule and not provoke insurgencies, we have to understand a couple of things. First of all, that by and large, the question of who ruled Afghanistan was seen as a problem of rulers, not of ordinary people. Somebody had to be your ruler. It wasn't going to be you. So the question was, whoever was able to establish power through conquest was perceived to be legitimate. The military that made this possible was mostly either tribally based troops, but more often mercenary troops. So we're dealing with a rather small number of people engaged in fighting, and once they took power, they tended to hold on to it for a long time. What this meant is, if we look, a striking thing about Afghanistan is that modern Afghanistan traces its origins back to 1747 and the foundation of an Afghan empire by Ahmad Shah Durrani. The interesting thing is that that dynasty lasted until 1978, more than 230 years. So that if we're looking at Afghanistan, what we see is that essentially when we read about wars in Afghanistan, it was largely between rivals within the royal family. People would fight each other, but essentially it was a fight that outsiders stayed out of, particularly the tribal people, because, as I mentioned, ordinary people had no role in government. Now, there was one group of people, the people along today's Pakistan-Afghan border, that refused to buy into this system. They refused to accept the legitimacy of governments in Kabul or Peshawar, refused to pay taxes. But it turned out that these people actually rarely revolted because governments rarely tried to rule them. In order to understand this, we have to look at models of government. And what we discover is that our idea of what a government should do and what a traditional Afghan government did was very different. I've compared these models of government to cheeses. That is, the Afghan governments had a Swiss cheese model. If you think about Swiss cheese, every slice is unique, and every slice has holes in it. And these holes are not defects. They come with the cheese. The strategy of rulers in Kabul or Herat or Bukhara, Samarkand or Peshawar or Delhi was essentially rule the cheese and ignore the holes. That is, there were only some parts of Afghanistan worth the cost of ruling. These were the cities, the major irrigated agricultural areas, the trade routes, strategic passes like the Khyber Pass. You tried and did directly control them, but they perhaps made up 12 to 15% of the land mass in Afghanistan. The rest of the area, which you might call cheese holes, you ruled indirectly. That is, the government didn't have one set of laws. It had multiple sets of laws and administrative systems, one for the cities, one for the heavily populated areas, and another for the tribal areas. Governments quickly decided that areas in the periphery were not worth the cost of governance, so they rarely tried to directly govern them. They instead substituted policies of indirect rule. Lack of taxation, sometimes they would be given rewards, sometimes they were given punishments, but you didn't try to reward them directly. Now, some people have said, well, this is because governments didn't have the power to do this. But actually, if we look at it, the British in India also chose the same way of ruling the Northwest Frontier Province. Today, when we look at the federally administered tribal area, the so-called FATA, which Pakistan has no direct control over, this is a legacy of the British, because the British followed the same model that the Afghans, the Mughals, the Safavids, all these people did. That is, they allowed Afghanistan to rule itself directly. Now, that is, they decided that when they saw these areas were defects that needed to be corrected. So you fill the holes, you fix the cheese. You have a single administrative system, and it's really important. The periphery must be made to obey the center. This is why the criticism of Karzai today, that he's only the mayor of Kabul. Well, most Afghan rulers were mostly the mayor of Kabul, but they really didn't choose to be much more than that. Direct rule is what we do. That's how you see whether a government succeeds or not. Now, this dual system of government lasted really well until essentially the 19th century, when we turned to the Anglo-Afghan wars. There were two Anglo-Afghan wars, 1839 to 42, the first one, second one, 1878 to 1880. These were conducted by the British from India, and they were attempting to rule Afghanistan directly. Afghanistan, it turned out, was a very easy place to invade. And it was very easy for the British to put new rulers on the throne. The difficulty was keeping them there. And one of the things that happens in the 19th century that's new is that there are actual insurgencies that break out against the British and the governments that they support. And these insurgents are not from the old elite, but they're from the rural areas. They're from the mountainous areas north of Kabul, the Pashtun tribes east of Kabul. And this is really something new in Afghanistan's history. It's the first time that a population at large takes a role in warfare and actually is able to overthrow a government. What the British discovered in the 19th century, again, it was easy to invade, hard to hold. This led to what was euphemistically known as setbacks. But fundamentally, these Afghan insurgencies were never able to beat the British. They could destroy whole armies. They did in the first Anglo-Afghan war. But the British were always able to send armies back and beat the insurgents. Instead, if we look at it, decisions both to invade Afghanistan and withdraw Afghanistan are largely political decisions made by the Home Office, if you will, either from Delhi or London. That is, it was decided that perhaps Afghanistan itself was a cheese hole and it was better to rule indirectly than directly. So in both Anglo-Afghan wars, the British discover it's too hard to hold on to and pull out. Well, this raises a question. Why were earlier conquerors able to conquer Afghanistan so easily, but that the British, and as we'll see later the Soviets, found insurgencies rising against them and rather effectively? Part of this is that tribal groups now had more efficient arms. In the old days, essentially, they were invaded by nomads that had cavalry. It was cavalry that was essentially the most efficient military arm. And in the 19th century, what we discover is that muskets and rifles allow people in the countryside to become rather effective in what we would call guerrilla war today. In the old days, even when we were talking about gunpowder weapons, tribal people in the countryside, they couldn't afford cannons. They didn't have the military technology on that. But once it became small arms, they became very, very effective. So when the British withdrew in the aftermath of the Anglo-Afghan wars, this had an impact inside Afghanistan. And this is important because it continues on today. If before the mid-19th century, whoever managed to conquer Kabul was considered legitimate, now there were new factors that were important for political legitimacy. And two of the most important were religious dimensions and Islamic dimensions. Of course, before the British came, essentially from about 1000 AD on, it was Muslims fighting other Muslims. So how could you really have much of a religious dimension? But in the fight against the British, it was partially pushed as a jihad, as a holy war against infidels. So this becomes an important aspect of Afghan policy and politics, that leaders in Kabul begin to say, we are protecting Afghanistan from non-Muslim outsiders. There's a religious dimension to this. There's also, for the first time, a nationalist dimension, that these insurgencies that are maintaining Afghanistan's independence, and Afghanistan was the only country in this part of the world that did maintain its independence, that was not colonized by the British or the Russians. Rulers begin to say, yes, you were all Afghans. Well, in the past, they weren't all Afghans. They were ruled by many different empires. They had many different identities. It's during the 19th and into the 20th centuries that governments in Kabul began to convince people that you are part of an Afghan nation, even if it happens to be multi-ethnic, even if it doesn't, different parts of the country that don't have that much in common. There is a feeling that, yeah, we are an independent country. However, this was a rather dangerous game for Afghan governments to play, and it's actually, we can see this kind of danger still continuing today. They needed to assure foreign powers like the British that only they, the rulers of Kabul, keep the unruly Afghans under control, and at the same time Afghans, that only they, the rulers, could keep the foreign powers out of Afghanistan. And they had to convince both sides. If you were seen as too close to the foreigners, then you were a puppet and rejected. But if you weren't able to keep control of Afghanistan, the foreigners that were on the outskirts of Afghanistan, in India, Russia, or whatever, felt they might need to intervene. So this was something that Afghan rulers actually were quite successful at, but it was a very difficult thing. After every insert into power, or an old ruler came back and managed to take money from the British while keeping them out. We actually find a similar thing happening in the 20th century, and by Afghans, and quite stable between 1900 and 1978. There was a civil war in 1929. It was over in 8 or 9 months. This ended in 1978 when the communist regime took power, instituted radical policies. This created an insurgency throughout Afghanistan, and in 1979, on Christmas, the Soviets intervened. They invade Afghanistan in order to prop up the communist government there. Now, the Soviet assumption was they would come in, they'd be out within a year, it shouldn't be too hard. Instead, their invasion created nationwide opposition and the beginning of a 10-year insurgency that devastated Afghanistan. They did get the Russians out, but at a tremendous cost. 1 million Afghans were killed, 4 to 5 million became refugees. When Gorbachev came out in the mid-1980s, he decided that Afghanistan was really not worth the effort, and by 19 and also literally every single Soviet troop went out. There were no bases. There was nobody left. This was a tremendous victory for the Afghan Mujahideen, the holy warriors that had forced the Soviets to withdraw. But the problem was that after the Soviets withdrew, the government, the former communists, really, they were communist in name only, managed to hold on with Russian aid, but then when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, its Afghan client collapsed within 6 months in April 19. Afghanistan ceases. A couple of reasons for this. The Soviet Union has fallen apart. Central Asia has become independent. But perhaps most importantly, the United States, which had promised to help rebuild Afghanistan once the communists were gone, decided that Afghanistan and indeed Pakistan, the whole region, was of no interest anymore. The United States pulls all of its aid out, is not interested in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan falls into civil war. The irony is the insurgency created to induce the Soviet withdrawal proved too weak to restore order and maintain stability after the regime fell. This leads to a pretty horrible civil war, kind of based on ethnicity and region. By the mid-1990s, what we find is the rise of the Taliban, conservative Pashtuns in the south. And this is a religious movement. Basically, it's mostly Pashtuns by ethnicity, but Mullah Omar, its leader, was declaring himself the commander of the faithful, leading an Islamic movement. They take power in 1996. They execute Najibullah, the last communist ruler. They were infamous for demanding that women stay secluded, not walk around with noisy shoes, essentially get out of teaching and government. And this is also the time in which Al-Qaeda begins setting up bases in Afghanistan. So they didn't show a whole lot of interest in the Taliban. They considered it not, it may have been a distasteful regime, but not worth the United States' interest. This changed, of course, after September 11th, 2001. It was quickly realized that Al-Qaeda had planned the attack on New York and Washington from Afghanistan. And the Bush administration demanded that Mullah Omar and the Taliban turn Osama bin Laden over to the United States, or at least expel him from Afghanistan. The Taliban refused. As a result, the United States invaded almost exactly 10 years ago to this week. And to everyone's great surprise, both Mullah Omar, Osama bin Laden, and indeed pretty much everybody else thought if the United States invades Afghanistan, it will be just like the Soviets. There will be a huge insurgency. The Taliban will, be able to retreat to the hills. Instead, the Taliban were thrown out. How did this work? Well, it was an interesting combination. The Americans provided high-tech aircraft and low-scale counter essentially with laser-guided bombs. But the people who actually won the war were the Northern Alliance, that is, the anti-Taliban Afghans. They cut the deal. There were fewer than 400 Americans on the ground at the end of 2001. It was the Afghans that cut the deal. So this seemed to be an unusual situation. Afghanistan had the reputation for not Taliban are thrown out after 10 weeks, but more importantly, why didn't an insurgency against the United States begin immediately? Well, this is essentially because this was not like the invasion of Iraq. This was Taliban Afghans did the deals, they fought the fight. They used American money and firepower, but they never surrendered the sovereignty of their country. The Americans got what they wanted. They expelled al-Qaeda and the Taliban from Afghanistan without. So this was seen as a great success. Probably this great success was overestimated in terms of how deep it was, because the Afghans welcomed the Americans largely because the United States solved a number of its problems, or they expected the United States to solve their problems. So what were Afghan expectations in 2002? Well, the Afghans, many Afghans at least, the anti-Taliban Afghans, initially saw the invasion as positive. It ended a pretty much almost 10-year civil war that had produced a tremendous amount of anarchy in Afghanistan. It ended Taliban misrule. The Taliban, Afghanistan, but as they consolidated their power, Afghans disliked their policies, and it turned out while they could bring order, they weren't bringing any economic development, they weren't helping the country progress. That made them unpopular. Also, the Taliban were seen to be in the pocket of Pakistan, that much of the fighting against the Northern Alliance by the end of the Civil War was being done with expatriate Arab jihadist troops and by Pakistanis fighting under the color of the Taliban. So, as one Afghan commander told me when I asked him, well, why would you guys even be appreciative at all of an American invasion? You don't like foreigners or invasions by foreigners. He says, yes, but we are to get rid of these guys. It's a fair trade. But the Afghans expected something of the United States and of the West. They expected security, and they expected the deployment of international forces nationwide to end warlords, because warlords had caused so much trouble during its Western allies, together known as the International Security Force, known as ISAF, would be deployed nationwide. This would say that warlords in various regions are out of business. It was also expected the United States would bring about large-scale economic development. One Afghan told me, yeah, we were invaded by the poor superpower, and now we've invaded by the rich superpower. You guys aren't going to leave till you fix the country up. They also hoped that Afghanistan would see a rapid restoration and expansion of the country's poor infrastructure. But in fact, the Afghans, although they may have had unrealistic expectations, were disappointed in what the international community did. And in fact, the international response to Afghanistan post-2002 is what sowed the seeds of failure that we're dealing with today, particularly with the Bush administration. This is not surprising because the Bush administration said we want to have a light footprint in Afghanistan. The Afghans don't really like foreigners, so we shouldn't do much there. The real reason for this was the Bush administration was focused on this invasion of Iraq. All of his attention, all of its troops, all of its money were moving to Mesopotamia. The Afghans felt this was going to suck all the air out of Afghanistan. Not enough would be left for Afghanistan, not either in terms of attention. In fact, when we look at it, what we see is the Bush administration allowed the United Nations to deal with governance. The United Nations might do okay with governance if the situation is relatively stable. It was not really equipped to deal with a situation like Afghanistan. Second, although people talked about billions of dollars flowing into Afghanistan, if we actually look at it, it got very little aid on a per capita basis, $50 or $60 per capita, 2003, 2004. Also, most of this money, billions of dollars, may have been spent, but very little of it actually got to ordinary Afghans. These contracts to do roads, to build schools, these were given to foreigners, and by and large the Afghans saw very little of the money. Also, the infrastructure was neglected. The road building that people expected to happen was very, very slow. And the economy remained, if you were an ordinary rural Afghan, very, very poor, and also drug dependent. By the 2000s, Afghanistan had become the largest producer of opium in the entire world. And that was a product that was very difficult to wipe out because that was the basic economy of large parts of the country. The other thing was that Afghans had expected international troops would move outside of the capital to bring about stability. Instead, the ISAF troops were confined almost completely to Kabul. There were a few troops that were put in major cities, but you're only talking a few hundred people. This allowed regional warlords to retain their influence. It also allowed the Taliban and Mujahideen factions opposed to the government to regroup. There was really nobody to stand against them. And perhaps one of the biggest problems was the United States relied upon Pakistan as, and named it, a major non-NATO ally. But in fact, from the point of view of the Afghans, this was no ally. This was an enemy that was actually harboring and supporting the Taliban in hopes that they would come back. Pakistan supports the Taliban with aid and bases. It facilitates attacks against the government, the Kabul government, and yet over the past 10 years it's received billions of dollars from the U.S. as a non-NATO ally. It's only recently, with the discovery that Osama bin Laden was in the country, in Pakistan, that debate in the United States has taken place is Pakistan an ally or an enemy? So what we have when we're looking at the Afghan government is that the Afghan government's legitimacy is relatively weak. And this is in part because the United States and its international allies tended to focus on process as opposed to outcome. What do I mean by that? Well, international backers, the UN, the United States, the European Union, all created or helped back things like Loya Jirgas, national assemblies where the Afghans could get together to debate what kind of government they want, helped them have a constitutional convention, held elections. The assumption was if you have these assemblies, if you have these elections, then the government that comes out of this is naturally a legitimate government. But the Afghans were less concerned with process. They really weren't all that concerned about how a government was created. They wanted to know, what did it actually do? One of my Afghan friends, told me, he said, no, you Americans, meaning Christians, he said, you pray before the meal. He says, but we Afghans, we pray only after we have eaten it. In other words, the Afghans were less concerned with elections, constitutions, how things were set up. What they wanted to know, once this government was in power, what would it do for them? How effective would it be? The failure to meet Afghan expectations undermined the Karzai government. What started off as minor levels of corruption that had been endemic in all Afghan governments soon reached enormous proportions, such that Afghans began to see or conceive of the government mostly as in business for itself. Kabul was also attacked by its enemies, the Karzai government, as a puppet of foreign backers. Karzai would often attack his foreign backers in speeches, but this merely alienated the Americans, the Europeans, without winning many friends among the Afghans. And one of the big problems which the United States and the international community failed to understand was that any government in Kabul would have difficulty in gaining legitimacy, in bringing about political stability, because of the historic tension between the center, the cities, and the rural periphery. The Taliban had come out of the rural areas. They represented rural values, particularly rural Pashtun values. The communists, the Karzai government, and indeed governments throughout the 20th century in Kabul had represented progressive Afghanistan. The question of what Afghanistan should be, should women have equal rights? Should there be freedom of religion, freedom of speech? All of these things that the international community simply accepted, well, the Afghans have signed all these international agreements ensuring these. Surely they must support these. The people who put power in Kabul did support these, but the people in the countryside were less supportive. And the Taliban were able to use this as a way to push a new insurgency, essentially after 2005, 2006. The Bush administration, however, did not really want to hear anything about Afghanistan. So as long as there wasn't too much of a trouble there, as long as there weren't any casualties to speak of, as long as the government wasn't about to collapse, the United States thought very little of the place. When the Bush administration ended and the Obama administration came in, we got a change because now Iraq was pretty much taken off of the political radar screen. It was clear the United States was pulling out, that war was winding down, and suddenly people began focusing on Afghanistan. And indeed, this year people said, it's America's longest war. Well, it's kind of America's longest war like Groundhog Day is Bill Murray's longest day. That is that there wasn't any real war in the first 5 years. In the last 5 years there has been a war, but it's been a very inconclusive war because it's not clear who the sides are. But one of the things that President Obama, once he was elected, and he had run on the grounds essentially that Iraq was the bad war, Afghanistan was the good war. Perhaps this was too simplistic. But there was the understanding that al-Qaeda, that had been supported by the Taliban, and if the Taliban came back, perhaps al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism would once again renew itself in Afghanistan. But there's also, if you're a Democratic president, I mean a Democratic Party president, there's great fear that should you pull out of Afghanistan and just say, who the hell cares what happens, then 5 years from now the Republicans are going to say, see, the Democrats lost it. So to some extent what we're looking at is American domestic politics. Can you afford to lose Afghanistan domestically? But also internationally there's the question that if Afghanistan is just left to its own devices to go back to anarchy and civil war, that is how we got the Taliban and al-Qaeda to begin with. In the 1990s we felt, who cares if there's a civil war and anarchy in Afghanistan? Today we understand that ungoverned parts of the world actually have consequences for places that are very far away. So Obama was put in a difficult situation. It was not his war, but on the other hand, he wanted to withdraw without leaving Afghanistan a mess that would fall back into what it was in the 1990s. So he created a troop surge to bring troops up to about 130,000 troops. On the other hand, he announced that all these troops would be gone by 2014. In their place, the United States and the international community began building up a large Afghan army. There are questions that are raised, how competent is the Afghan army, can it really act on its own? But at the same time, it sought negotiation with the Taliban because even the military, particularly General Petraeus, said this war will not end on the battlefield, it will end in negotiations. On the other hand, the military believed that negotiations with the Taliban would not really be successful unless the Taliban believed that they needed to negotiate because they weren't going to win militarily. So there have been negotiations with the Taliban, but as the recent assassination of former President Rabbani, who headed Afghan Peace Council, many Afghans say, well, which Taliban are we talking about? If the Taliban are coming to negotiations to blow up the negotiators, they can't really be all that serious. At the same time, there's a realization that you can't have peace in the country without putting more pressure on Pakistan. That while there's certainly many things within Afghanistan that help perpetuate the insurgency, it could probably not expect to be victorious without support from Pakistan. And Pakistan itself sees that if the United States leaves, it wants the Taliban to take over. It turns out the United States and Pakistan interests are pretty much diametrically opposed. Right now, the United States is putting more pressure on Pakistan, but it's not clear whether they'll be able to get an agreement because of that. And finally, in order to get out of Afghanistan, you need a stronger and more legitimate Afghan government. One of the things that we need to look at is, yes, been in charge since 2002. But rulers no one.
Hi everyone, this is Maggie from Primary Source. I think we're having a little audio problem. Tom, if you can hear me, we lost you for a minute and it was kind of fuzzy. So I'm gonna try to unmute you again and see what we can do. Tom, can you go ahead?
Karzai postcard, and that's one of the biggest problems we face. Thank you very much.
Liz, are you there? Liz, are you there?
We'll try that again. Can you hear me, Maggie?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. We're having some audio problems. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. Obviously, we lost a little bit of Professor Barfield there. So if you do have questions about the Afghan endgames, that last slide and some of that he was talking about, please do send those questions in the question box, and we'll make sure to address those. We have plenty of time for questions, so take advantage of that and send those in if you haven't already tried to do that. We'll try muting and then unmuting Professor Barfield again, and then hopefully we'll be able to field some questions there. So let's see. Professor Barfield, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. So it looks like our audio problems are hopefully resolved. People are starting to send in some questions for you, but I also know that there were some questions that had come in during the presentation. So let's see what we have to say. We have a question here from someone named Michael who's asking, could you say something about U.S. support for the Mujahideen in the 1980s? Is it fair to say that the U.S. engaged in a proxy war against the Soviets using bin Laden and others?
The United States did engage in a proxy war against the Soviet Union. Both the United States and Saudi Arabia financed Mujahideen parties. They subcontracted that to Pakistan, so it wasn't actually either the United States or the Saudis who were involved in that directly. But there's something of a misnomer that that bin Laden was involved in that. He was a very minor player in this. That both the Taliban and the real trouble in Afghanistan begins after the collapse of the Soviet-backed regime in 1992. And the Taliban really don't get going until the mid-1990s. So while the United States supported Mujahideen, mostly by subcontracting to Pakistan that supported, because Pakistan supported the radical Islamist parties, there were other Islamist parties that we could have supported directly, we didn't. So when we're looking at this, I would say it was less the problem of supporting a proxy war against the Soviet Union than not taking responsibility for its aftermath.
Great, thank you. And we also had a few people, the part that kind of blipped out there was the very conclusion about the post-Karzai era. So we have a couple people asking if you could kind of repeat your conclusion there about the post-Karzai era.
Yes. Yes, if we talk about 2014, that's the date that international troops wish to turn basic military authority and responsibility over to the Afghans. So we talk about 2014 as the transition date. It's almost always on the international component. What I wanted to bring out is that Karzai's presidential term also ends in 2014, and by the Afghan constitution he cannot run for another term. But Karzai has been the single ruler of Afghanistan since 2002. Therefore, it should be the responsibility of the United States and the international community to engage with the Afghans in talking about what is a post-Karzai era. Who's going to be, even if it's going to be determined by election, encouraging the formation of political parties, encouraging the dialogue and debate in order to talk about how Afghanistan should be restructured, simply because it's clear that the organization of the Karzai government is probably too centralized to be effective. But more important than that, we need a long head start for the Afghans themselves to decide what's the government going to look like when Hamid Karzai is gone.
Great, thank you. We also have a question from Landon who's asking, will the Swiss cheese model work today? Why or why not?
The Swiss cheese model is a little old-fashioned, but then so is Afghanistan. The long period of peace and stability in Afghanistan, from the Afghan Civil War in 1929 to the Soviet invasion in 1979, this is a half-century of peace. That's the longest era of peace in Afghanistan under King Zaire Shah and his father. And one reason that dynasty was so effective was it did practice the Swiss cheese model, that it was very progressive in the cities. It abolished the requirement that women wear full veils. It pushed for education. It pushed for modernization. But it let these things happen in Kabul and the major cities and then ooze out into the countryside. It didn't try to force things upon people. So while there might be a single Afghan law, there was a tendency to apply it in the cities and let the people in the countryside come along with the program in the longer term. So yes, what I would argue is that that thinking about this Swiss cheese model of that you might need 2 or 3 different ways to govern the country as opposed to a single way is what we should do. I should remind people that the United States has the oldest federal government in the world. Our federal constitution allows states like Mississippi and Massachusetts that are culturally quite different to be part of the same union without killing each other, at least since the end of the Civil War.
That's a good point, at least for now, right? We have a question from Jennifer saying, is there a role for the Taliban in the post-Karzai era?
One of the problems about determining a role for the Taliban is the Taliban or not, a united movement. I would say there's not a role for the Taliban as a national movement with Mullah Omar, who wants his emirate back. He sees the creation of any kind of coalition government as a stepping stone to take over all of Afghanistan once the foreigners leave. However, most of the Taliban, if you will, foot troops are below Mullah Omar. Many of them are more concerned with what would their role be in southern Afghanistan or eastern Afghanistan. I think it's possible within Afghanistan to cut a deal with the Taliban, in part because many members of the Karzai government, for example, are members of the Hizb-i-Islami. This is the party led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's allied with the Taliban in fighting the Karzai government, but at the same time many of his followers are within the Kabul government. So what I think is that national level negotiations are likely to fail, but that local accommodations are quite feasible.
Okay, next we have a question from Satine, who says that as a Pakistani, she's often heard that Pakistan feels similarly to Afghanistan in that the U.S. leaving after 1991 created problems for Pakistan as well. So she's hoping that you can expand on Pakistan's role in supporting the Taliban and what their motivation might be in doing so.
Pakistan certainly suffered when the United States pulled out all of its aid. But Pakistan used that political vacuum in Afghanistan to push a policy that the Pakistani military saw what they called strategic depth. That is, they said it was in Pakistan's national interest to be able to make the government in Kabul Pakistan's client, a Pakistani client, so that their borders would be secure. One of the problems of this is that it put Pakistani policy sort of up against Afghan nationalism. And here both the United States and Pakistan have different ideas about what a free and secure Afghanistan looks like. And to some extent, particularly during the Taliban period, Afghans complained that Pakistan thought of Afghanistan as its 5th province, and they saw themselves as an independent nation. It should be said that sort of the disputes between Pakistan and Afghanistan go back to Pakistan's very origins in 1947. Afghanistan was the only country to vote against Pakistan's admission to the United Nations on the ground it was an illegitimate state. The Afghans have also refused to recognize the Durand Line, the boundary between Pakistan and Afghanistan as a legitimate boundary. They said it was written by the British and should be renegotiated. So there's been plenty of sort of disputes between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and to some extent many Afghans, particularly non-Pashtuns, fear that Afghan policy towards Pakistan, if it gets too close, means that Pakistan will take over. Pakistan, on the other hand, is concerned that hostility by Afghans towards Pakistan might lead to an alliance with India. The fact that Karzai just came back from Delhi with a light alliance has certainly, caused Pakistan to worry more about that.
Great. You actually also answered a question from Margaret in that same response, so thank you. Kristen writes in and is asking if there are any books about Afghanistan and its current history that you would recommend for further reading for teachers or even for students.
Well, naturally, an author takes pride of place, but my new book, Afghanistan, A Cultural and Political History, which should be out in paperback in next month, and also the Kindle edition is now under $10, is a comprehensive history. So without being too immodest, I would recommend my own book on this. But any good bookshop now has a lot. There's plenty of books on Afghanistan, so you can begin in quite a number of different places.
Great, and we'll actually be sharing a resource for checking out other options for resources on Afghanistan in just a moment. So we have just a few minutes left for the Q&A, and quite a few of our participants are teachers who work with students on a regular basis and are trying to kind of think about how to approach this topic with them. So our question, I think, to wrap up will be to ask you what you think is the most important thing about Afghanistan that students can impart to their students. What do students today really need to take away and to know as they think about Afghanistan and as they read about it and see it on the news?
Well, I think one of the most important things for teachers to students that Afghanistan is a real place with real people. It can look very strange and alien if you're just looking on the TV, but in fact it has a very vibrant culture. People who have been there, have come back. It's a place that wins practically the heart of any visitor who's there. I would recommend for teachers to take a look at the Asia Society website. It's a really excellent way of getting their students into the culture of Afghanistan. But I think the most important thing would perhaps, before talking about the war in Afghanistan, would be talk about Afghanistan itself. Many people think it's an Arab country. It isn't. No Arabic is spoken in Afghanistan. Many people think that, oh, well, it's a brand new nation. Actually, it's about as old as the United States. As I mentioned, it was formed about a generation before the United States declared its independence. So one of the most important things is to try to understand the people and the culture, I think, and before turning to the politics and questions of American involvement there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Professor Barfield, for your time and for your great presentation and for your responses to the questions. And thank you to everyone out there who's joined us today. We appreciate you coming and attending at the end of a long day, and we also certainly appreciate your patience while we figured out some of those audio issues. I just want to take a few moments to tell you about some resources and upcoming events that will help kind of flesh out this topic about Afghanistan for you. As I said earlier, this was just the first in 3 webinars that Primary Source is sponsoring thanks to the support of the Asia Society. Our next webinar is taking place on November 2nd and will focus on the role of religion and ethnicity in modern Afghanistan, and it will also run from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. And then on November 30th, we'll have a look at the historical art and architecture in Afghanistan, and that will be facilitated by Sheila Blair of Boston College. And if you're looking for those resources, good books, films, other information about how you can bring Afghanistan to your students or even just read up a little bit on yourself, we'd encourage you to check out and share our Afghanistan Online Resource Guide. You can reach that at the website that's showing right now. It's resources.primarysource.org/Afghanistan. And on that website are links to the Asia Society and some of its great resources, including Homeland Afghanistan. And before we wrap up, we do want to say a special thank you to the Asia Society, who's been a fantastic partner in bringing these webinars to you and making them free to you. So a big thank you to the Asia Society. It's been a great collaboration. And we just invite everyone to stay in touch with us at Primary Source. You can keep up with what we're offering and what we're doing at our website, primarysource.org. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And we often post YouTube videos that are useful and interesting for your own knowledge or for your classroom. So we'd encourage you to check us out on YouTube as well. Another huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. It was a great time to bring together people from across the states. We'd appreciate if you stay tuned. There'll be a brief 3-question survey that will appear when you exit the webinar. It would be really helpful for you to respond to that. We'll take your comments into consideration as we plan future events. So thank you again, and we can't wait to join you again on our next webinar.